Hey everyone, I'm Jason Ford, and I am excited to share with you the 2.0 release of my Python-based threat intelligence aggregation project that I have called Intel Collector. There's a bunch of new stuff happening in this release, so I thought it might be worthwhile recording a few thoughts and going over some of the features and maybe going through a little demo with some things that you can do using the new version of the project. So with that, let's hop right into it. So there's a bunch of stuff that has changed in this version of Intel Collector. The biggest thing being that everything is now modular. Intel sources have their own individual libraries. So API keys are going to be set from within each individual library. This is going to give us a bunch of additional functionality and make it a lot easier to add new sources going forward, as the code base for the primary Intel Collector script will remain relatively the same, and we can just add new sources of intelligence as they become available or as you find your own sources that you would like to be able to add to the project. A few things to take note of is that libraries are no longer going to parse JSON to do string manipulation. There was a bunch of stuff that I did when I originally created the script in order to take the JSON response, parse through the text, remove some characters, and do a bunch of other stuff that would reformat it into CSV format. Now, everything is going to be stored as JSON in a Python dictionary that will correspond to the API that it was pulled from. This is going to do a bunch of things. It's going to standardize the way that responses show up, both in the flat file as well as now the script has the ability to return all of the API responses as JSON, which will also make it much more extensible so that you can include this in your own libraries and projects. Something else, if you've used the Intel Collector script in the past, that you'll notice is that the output that goes to the command line has been condensed significantly. Sources that return data are now only going to give you one of two outputs. You'll either see something was found in whatever the source was, or there was a response from the source. In a lot of cases, a 200 response from some of these APIs will actually return empty values. So there's no way to tell, in some cases, whether you're actually going to get data back, but you will notice that if something was found, it will say found. If you just got a response back, even though it may be an empty response that's entered into the CSV file, it'll say response from that source. Something else to take note of is that the validate library that I added in the previous version of Intel Collector has been updated with a new regex that checks domain names only for top-level domains. So the way that the libraries work right now is that we are actually submitting domain names that are just TLDs. I updated the regex so that subdomains cannot be submitted, so it's only going to work with top-level domains. Now, a couple other things to take note of in this release. We've got a new free threat intelligence source, the Stratosphere IPS, courtesy of the Czech Technical University, which will give you the ability to compare against their block lists for IP addresses. Big shout out to my friend Brian Campbell for the suggestion on this one. Thanks, Bri. And also something to take note of is that in this release, I have actually removed, hopefully temporarily, both sorbs and spam houses and lookups. I will more than likely add these back in a future release, but in order to standardize everything into the new layout where all of the Intel sources are in their own libraries returning JSON, I went ahead and cut those for this release, and we'll look to re-add those in the future. So with that, let's hop over and do a short demo that goes through some of the new functionality, also the layout of what the libraries look like, and then I'll show you an example of some things that you could do with these libraries for some of your own projects. So let's hop over and take a look at the code base first and foremost. So some of the things that you'll notice in this version is that we are now importing individual Python libraries for each of the sources of intelligence. Everything's been commented in here to show you which libraries do what. The validation library that was included in the last release, as well as all of the sources of threat intelligence identifying which each one of these is. So this will make it really easy for you to swap them in and out, also remove the ones that you don't want to use, and so forth. The rest of the script probably looks very similar to previous versions, with the exception of a few things. We're now, again, storing everything in a Python dictionary. The key for each of those dictionaries is going to correspond to the API that you are pulling the data from. And then the output is still going to go to CSV. the layout of those files has changed. As I mentioned, we're no longer doing a bunch of string manipulation. So you're going to see the actual raw JSON response just formatted for a CSV file. With that in mind, that's going to be most of the changes that you'll see here. Otherwise, the library works very, very similarly to how it has worked in previous versions. The big change, as I mentioned, is going to be that the individual sources of threat intelligence now have their own Python library. So you'll see for the one for CrowdStrike, in the event that you are a CrowdStrike customer and you want to be able to query the custom indicator API, you'll go ahead and you'll put your client ID and secret in at the top here, and then it works exactly the way it did in all previous versions of Intel Collector. Same thing goes for the rest of these, whether it be Echo Trail, whether it's Emerging Threats Intelligence, File Scan IO, and so on down the list. You will submit your API key inside the individual libraries rather than doing it in the Intel Collector script itself. So I mentioned we could do a quick demo, so I'll pop over so you can actually see what it looks like. You're going to actually leverage the libraries in the exact same fashion that it has shown in the README for all the previous versions of Intel Collector. So you'll import your library, go ahead and initialize it, and then you can go ahead and just submit your queries for whatever it is that you would want to go look for. So in this case, one of my favorites that shows up in the README as well is to go out and look for an IP address. You'll see that you get command line output that will indicate which sources of intelligence we have actually found that IP address in, and then you will be brought back to your CLI. You're not going to get a bunch of additional command line output. We didn't include in this version, for example, prepending the line with the IP address, the domain name, or the hash in most cases. So that'll be a slight difference that you'll see, is just the fact that the command line output has been condensed significantly. So in any case, the functionality of the script remains largely the same. Again, the big difference here is the fact that you will have the ability to now sort of swap out very easily new or different sources of threat intelligence, depending on if you want to include your own, maybe that you have access to, maybe you have some internal sources, or whatever the case may be. So the last thing that I wanted to share is just some examples of how you could use this library for your own projects. Obviously, just working at a Python CLI is one way to do this. I've seen examples of some folks that are leveraging this in their own workflows, and they're essentially just doing everything, from a CLI. But there's also a ton of other ways that you could leverage this as a background process for, a web application, as an example. So something that just wanted to share with everybody that'll give you an idea of what that could look like. This is just a really simple mock-up that I did with Flask, where the Intel Collector script is essentially doing all the work on the back end, but we've just created a really simple HTML front end for this to make it a lot easier. I recognize that not everybody is as familiar with Python, or maybe is not in a place where they feel comfortable being able to use this as part of their day-to-day. So this is an example of how you could use the script on the back end and actually provide a really nice, simple front end to be able to go and do those queries in the exact same way that you could before. So you can type your queries in here. I just opened up a couple of tabs to show you sample responses, just as a real quick example. But if I was to search for that exact same IP address that we just did via command line, you'll see that everything is just the JSON output. We just do a little JSON to HTML conversion in this case to output it to the screen rather than sending it to a CSV file. So that's it. That's a real brief overview of some of the things that have been added in version 2.0 of Intel Collector. I hope this library has been useful to you. I appreciate all of the support from the information security community. In the event that you haven't had the opportunity to actually go out and check out Intel Collector, you can find it on GitHub. You can also find the link to it from Twitter at Jason Ford. Thanks very much.